In a 2004 essay for the New Left Review, theorist and literary critic Fredric Jameson wrote, "Utopias are non-fictional, even though they are also non-existent. Utopias, in fact, come to us as barely audible messages from a future that may never come into being." In today's episode of The Breakdown, I explore the idea and the power of utopia with my guest, Kim Stanley Robinson, the acclaimed science fiction author whose most recent novel, The Ministry for the Future, offered a vision of how we might respond to climate breakdown. Today, Stan and I discuss the politics of science and technology, the place of speculative fiction in an era so dominated by nostalgia, and the importance of utopia at a time when our political imaginations are so constrained. Like Ministry for the Future itself, this episode is dedicated to the late Fredric Jameson, who passed away this week and whose towering intellect has, I'm sure, influenced the ideas of many listeners, as it has my own. And for those who are unfamiliar with Jameson but interested, some suggestions for where to start with his work can be found in the notes for today's episode. I'm Adrienne and you're listening to The Breakdown. Kim Stanley Robinson, thank you so much for joining us on The Breakdown this morning.
No, it's my pleasure, thanks.
So I have to admit, I've been very excited about this interview, having read a few of your novels, not all of them, admittedly, but still working my way through the very large collection, the oeuvre, if you will. But for the benefit of some people listening who may not be as familiar with your work, it'd be great if you could just sort of introduce yourself to us a little bit and also explain a bit about how you started out in fiction and the utopian tradition in particular.
Sure, my pleasure. It's been a lifelong thing. I was a reader as a child and loved it. And I grew up near the beach in Southern California and was a beach kid. And when I grew up, it was Orange County, it was orange trees. And during my childhood and youth, those orchards got ripped out at a tremendous rate to turn into suburbia and the freeway systems. So I think I saw something that marked me later. At the time, it was just the natural order of things. But when I ran into science fiction as an undergraduate at UC San Diego, it struck me hard. It seemed like a kind of a realism. The way life had felt to me, science fiction expressed better than any of the other things I was reading, which is surprising still, but true. So I began to read science fiction intensively, and this was during the period of the New Wave, which is really the 60s. It was the excitement of the 60s expressed in science fiction, which is really part of the 60s vibe. The novels like Dune or Dahlgren, The Left-Handed Darkness, these were all, and Stranger in a Strange Land by Crazy Bob Heinlein. These were all part of hippie culture, of 60s culture, and also Vonnegut. His novels were science fiction, even though he was published as if he weren't science fiction, but he was, obviously. And these were all big impact and part of 60s culture. So I was part of that. And so I've been writing science fiction my entire career. And one thing you can say, of stories set in the future, they express a theory of history on the part of the writer, just why do things happen the way they do. It gets into the text and the subtext. But also, the future is either going to be better or it's going to be worse. So you have your utopias, you have your dystopias. A famous and easy distinction to make in stories about the future. And I had a early on trio of novels set in my hometown, where one of them was after a brief nuclear war, the After the Fall novel, a famous subgenre, then a dystopia, then I had to write a utopia called Pacific Edge, which I did. But it was difficult and unsatisfying, and it made me want to try it again. So that's when I wrote the Mars trilogy, which was a utopian novel that, in order to deal with everything I felt that needed to be dealt with, it turned into this 2,000-page trilogy. And even there, I guess you could say that putting a utopia on Mars is a way of taking it away from our own reality. And one often does that with utopia. Utopia is the no place. It's an island where there was a peninsula, but they cut the Great Trench. This is in Moore's original Utopia, to separate themselves from ordinary history. Well, that's one of the reasons that utopia has this negative connotation as the thing that will never happen. So it was H.G. Wells who began to write utopias connected into history and saying this is how we would get there, and redefining the genre as not the story of the perfect society, but the story of going in a better direction. So utopian fiction becomes, especially with Le Guin's The Dispossessed, utopian fiction becomes a story about history going better. And I've been pursuing that one ever since, including my most recent novel, The Ministry for the Future.
So I have a lot I want to ask you about, but I'd actually love to just start by picking up on that last point about utopian fiction as a history in which things get better. I mean, Ministry for the Future, as the title suggests, it's obviously a very kind of future-facing book, and the characters in it, you know, as they try to resolve the climate crisis, they're always thinking about future generations and their impact on people long after they're gone. And although we hear politicians, you know, use that phrase in political speeches when they talk about the climate, I think, you know, the gap between that rhetoric and where politics actually stand is huge, because it feels like we're in this political moment where the preoccupation with nostalgia is so profound, and, you know, with looking backward because the past is when things were better. And I'm obviously thinking here about, you know, MAGA, but, you know, on the left, we're just as guilty, I think, of being preoccupied with reproducing the past, you know, the golden age of industrial labor organizing, for example, and also sometimes, you know, aversion to new technologies, which I want to come to later. But I guess for now, my question is, you know, how do you see the role of science fiction in this political moment, and how can it help us with the task of, you know, imagining a radically better future?
Well, there is a lot of nostalgia in science fiction for earlier societies. So very often science fiction has concerned itself with future technologies. So you see in earlier science fiction humanity going to the stars, which is magical and can't even happen. But technology was being equated with magic. And yet it would be this kind of military, patriarchal 1950s social order that was zooming around the Milky Way. And this was nostalgia to the max. That things will never change at the level of human society is a bad mistake, because society is changing all the time. So that's just one strand. There's a lot of science fiction. Indeed, Utopian says that we could run things better than we are. So one thing I think that makes it difficult to write now is that we're in the polycrisis, and history has accelerated. Sociologists talk about the great acceleration. This is since World War II. Everything that we measure about humanity has been accelerating in sometimes drastic hockey stick style since the end of World War II. But also, I'm going to say that we accelerated again within that acceleration in the pandemic. Things since 2020 seem to be going faster. And in my novel, Ministry for the Future, many things that I talk about happening in the 2030s and the 2040s, they're already happening or have already happened. So in this acceleration, when you try to write about a future, better, worse, or the same, it's hard to stay caught up with reality itself, and you end up writing a peculiar kind of realism where the changes you postulate are kind of symbolic to the way things feel. Now that's fine, but then you have to organize your internal history of your science fiction novel. This happened, then that happened, and that caused the other thing to happen, and here we are in the year 2061. As more and more things are going wrong and more things are going right at the same time all across the world, it simply gets confusing. What story do you tell that clarifies that situation without losing the plot? And in this case, with novels, I mean literally losing the plot. And so I feel like I managed to succeed in Ministry for the Future, because this was perhaps my sixth or seventh attempt at a utopian science fiction novel, in balancing all those factors and finding a through line, a few characters you follow, but then the whole rest of the world takes up the rest of the novel in a kind of episodic style. And so the form was right for the content. That doesn't always happen for me, and I can tell it isn't easy for anybody. So one retreats to nostalgia to get to the origin of your question, or really what you were asking about, because the present is so deeply confusing and could result in either incredible catastrophe or incredible prosperity. That wide a range of possibilities that are quite realistic from our moment right now, it's so disorienting that people retreat to, oh, if only it were like the 1950s, things would be simpler. Well, the 50s were not simple. Nostalgia is always a simplification of the past and focusing on elements you want to focus on and forgetting the intense complexities of that older moment of history. So nostalgia does us very little good, except to maybe try to focus the mind on this. What was good in human society that we want to hold on to? And then that can be part of the argument.
And just to continue with Ministry for the Future for a minute, I had this interaction about 6 months ago, maybe, at a conference in Germany with Andreas Malm, who, for those who aren't familiar, is an author and activist, sort of a firebrand. And his work, I guess, maybe influences Ministry, but he and I sort of both came to this realization during a conversation that, when we've spoken to policymakers or even, people in finance about what influences how they've been thinking about climate, a lot of them have said it isn't, an economics textbook or even, the IPCC reports, but it's Ministry for the Future. And elsewhere in a podcast episode on The Dig, which I highly recommend everyone listens to, I heard you describe your novels, and I'm paraphrasing here, but you describe your novels as your praxis. So I'd love if you could just sort of expand on that last point and tell us how you see the power of fiction to, I guess, change the world, if we're putting it dramatically, but maybe more modestly, just to speak to really concrete political challenges in a way that maybe a more overt, direct engagement can't always do.
Well, this is a good question. And I think it must come down to the notion of story and our intense interest in other people's stories. But before I get into that, I want to say I wish I had met Andreas Malm. I presume and hope I will someday. His book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, is really an important book. And it was published after Ministry for the Future. And I read it and I thought, damn, if I had read this book before I wrote Ministry, I would have had a better novel in this one sense that is quite important. Malm makes a distinction between murder and sabotage, that murder is always wrong, but that sabotage, the breaking of things, might sometimes be the right course of action for a responsible human on this planet. Well, that's an obvious distinction once somebody's made it. But at the time I wrote Ministry, in my novel, the two kinds of actions are completely confused. Now that makes it more like history itself, because in history itself, sabotage often leads to murder and vice versa. It's a messy world we're in, and Ministry is a messy novel. But it's also what Brecht called a Lernstück, a learning piece. And if there had been one more chapter, instead of 106 chapters, 107 chapters, and one of them made this clarification out of Malm, and I would have acknowledged him in the text, because as a Lernstück, there's lots of essay-like chapters in Ministry that simply talk about other thinkers. Then I would have given readers a tool to understand and judge the actions in my novel in a way that would make it a little less messy. So back to the idea of story, we've got all this expository information. It pours in on us every day, and it can get tiresome to try to sort out what's interesting and important amongst the onslaught of information every day. Then you have a story where some characters that you co-create in your mind, and this is the power the novel has. The reader does a lot of work. The reader has to look at black marks on a page, and then an experience happens in their head. That's their accomplishment. And so the writer sets up like a prompt, and it's a kind of a collaboration between writer and reader. And a generous reader gives a whole lot of mental energy and time, and they come out of it with an experience that is pseudo-real, that it's maybe like a powerful dream you don't forget. And in your memory, everything is reconstructed in memory, not happening to you, but in your mind, created again. A novel that you read that impresses you can be like an experience that you've had. And it is an experience you've had. It's just a fictional experience. So if the characters are if the marks on the page are enticing enough that in your head there's people that you know and you're interested in their lives and you read their biographies and, so to speak, you live with them, the crucial moments in their life, that's just more fun. That's what it comes down to. It feels more vivid in the literal sense of the word. It feels more alive. So there you have it, I think. And I'm pleased. It's lovely to hear this from Malm, who's such an important political philosopher in our time. But I hear it a lot. Ministry for the Future has been widely read by people who care about what we do right now. And that's a nice thought.
Well, and it made it onto Obama's, books of the year, which I have to say I do find interesting and funny, but only because he so closely resembles, I think, many of the characters that are, maligned in the book.
Well, it's true. I have a theory about that. There was another book by another Robinson on that particular list, a novel by Marilyn Robinson. And, Obama is married to a Robinson. So I think when he sees that name, he's thinking, good associations, I'll give this book a try. So I think that's a subconscious reason as to why he even tried my book. And I too find it interesting that he liked it because he was stuck in the position of making life and death decisions extrajudicially. He had to say, yes, murder that person for the greater good to his operatives. Well, this is an awful burden, and it's actually not something that anybody should want to be put into a position to do. It's yet another reason. Don't run for president of the United States because you may be put with those kind of decisions. And indeed, my character Badim in Ministry for the Future is precisely the one. We don't know what he's authorized and what he hasn't. And the reader has to decide, would I do this? Would I do that? Did the ministry do this? Or did some random private actor do this? And in the novel, you are forced to decide yourself, because I keep a lot of that hidden, partly out of my own moral squeamishness and partly out of a desire to put the burden on the reader, like the imaginative burden. Would I authorize this kind of violent action? And again, if I had read Malm, it would have been perhaps even more explicitly difficult. But it was nice that Obama liked it. He did the best he could. And, what can you say?
And obviously, expands the audience quite a bit, which never hurts.
Yeah, absolutely. That's for sure.
But yeah, I think, I guess to me, he's sort of emblematic of that kind of quagmire that the Democrats are maybe eternally in when it comes to climate, which is sort of playing both sides. It's like, yes, we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which is great, but it's come also with this devil's deal for all these new opportunities for oil and gas licenses. And, here's Obama endorsing this quite radical book that includes, eco-activists sabotaging all sorts of fossil fuel assets and captures, the horrors of what is potentially to come. But at the same time, up until recently, he's celebrating that he oversaw this massive, unprecedented oil and gas boom in the United States during his presidency. Anyways, I digress a bit, but actually I think that it speaks for me, I guess, to this series of tensions in your work that are obviously very fertile, as a reader, but I also find really politically fertile, particularly when it comes to tensions, not between climate scientists and deniers or anything, but more with respect to, I think, the really complex challenges that the climate crisis in particular raises for progressives or the left, or however you want to describe it. So I'd love to just unpack a few of those, thinking mostly about Ministry, but also the Mars trilogy, which was published, in the 90s, but feels incredibly relevant to today and which I highly recommend. And one of the things I think that stands out in a lot of your novels is that characters, or heroes often that recur, tend to be, bureaucrats. And there are often institutions that we might not think of as traditionally progressive, like, central banks or ministries of the United Nations, that appear again and again as kind of forces for good. And so I'd be interested to know, what you see as the emancipatory potential within these institutions that I think for a lot of us might be viewed as, representative of the interests of capital. I mean, even the UN, which is meant to be this kind of egalitarian body between nations, it's ultimately comprised of representatives from states that are capitalist in nature and
who domestically are often serving those interests. So I'd love if you could just speak to that a bit.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I agree with the bases of your question. I am a leftist, and we live in a capitalist world. So what then do you do? And then what does leftist mean in our moment? Very often, I'll just say at this point, the left is government and the right is business. And so capital and the state, finance and the state are in a massive battle for control of world history, of human society. So at that point, the government becomes the good guys, and the governments can be bought by capital, but they set the laws. So the real power, you might say, is still in the hands of government, which indemnifies the money and runs the armies and enforces the laws. And the laws, if the laws were leftist, the government would enforce them and back them with money. So this is how I see our current moment. And Raymond Williams, a very great Marxist literary critic from England, talked about the long march through the institutions, that if you don't have the possibility of a successful revolution, and revolution itself, if it gets conceptualized as the French Revolution, as a war, then you're really looking down the barrel of a bad situation. First revolution perhaps can't work in our moment, and if it did, it might have a backlash more severe than the problems that we're facing now. We're in an emergency climactically to where an orderly progression into a better, more government-driven, more leftist world is the best strategy for escaping a mass extinction event. This is my read of it, and this is the story I've been telling in my novels. So at that point, the bureaucrats matter, the institutions matter. My wife was a lifelong employee of the U.S. Geological Survey. Now that's kind of a nonpartisan, it doesn't make policy. It's a sort of a federal university, you might say, a research institute studying the Earth in all of its manifestations. So the USGS is, by its very nature, an environmentalist organization because it's saying to the world, this is what keeps us alive, and this is what we're doing to damage our chances of keeping alive. What are you going to do about it? Then the rest of the government has to take over, the executive and the legislature. And something like the IRA bill of the Biden administration is a tremendous legislative achievement. But you could also have what in my book they call carbon quantitative easing, that governments make money in the first place, that fiat money is the only real money, that cryptocurrencies are kind of a scam, or a private contractual arrangement that will break down and is usually only kept amongst scammers. So fiat money is government money, and government can make up that money from scratch. It does all the time, and then spend it on carbon and green projects, decarbonization projects first, after which the money circulates into the general economy just like ordinary money. So there's an immense power in government, and it's opposed by the immense power of private capital. So, and private capital buys the legislators who then write the laws. That's not good. But private capital also creates the jobs by saying we're going to invest in X rather than Y. So if private capital was convinced that the highest rate of returns, and then that phrase becomes very important, was to result from investing in green projects, then we'd have both sides of current society on the green project. So government has to create guardrails and incentives, sticks and carrots, to force capital to do the right thing. And one way to do that would be to say, look, the highest rate of return, as long as you pay attention to that measurement system and change it to accord with reality itself better, the highest rate of return is the green project, not the fossil fuel destructive project. You maybe have to do the Ministry for the Future thing. You maybe have to say 50 years out, the highest rate of return is going to be the green project, and then enforce that long view by way of laws, by sticks and carrots that are legal in their nature, and hope for the best. And I see signs of this happening. This is a highly theoretical and leftist analysis of the situation, but I also see the real world of private capital tilting and looking, because the individuals are still operating it, and they realize that a mass extinction event and climate change in its most extreme forms are simply bad for business. So we're beginning to see a green business push. We're beginning to see green investment from private capital just as a way to make a living, in fact, to make a profit, which I would distinguish making a living from making a profit, with making a living necessary and making a profit a kind of a scam or theft. In the standard leftist view that capital steals from labor. And you don't even want to call it labor. Capital steals from people so that you get out of that rubric. And so I was just, in the last 5 years, since I wrote Ministry for the Future, what I'm seeing is rather encouraging. There's a sense of desperation that is driving some good moves.
Well, I definitely hope that you're right on that front. But I want to touch on a different point, and this is another kind of tension among leftists or progressives, whatever you want to call it, when it comes to climate that I think is really explored in your work, and that is our relationship to science and to technology in particular. I mean, as a science fiction writer, naturally, you're concerned with the power of new technologies, and in Ministry, the case is really made that we desperately need them if we're going to come to grips with the climate crisis. One of these, notably, is geoengineering, and there are various types that appear in Ministry, notably solar radiation management, but there's also plenty in there that's a little bit more mundane, like carbon capture and storage, which plays a big role, and even proposals like using blockchain to crack down on tax evasion. But I think for a lot of people, certainly in the climate space and on the left, a small bubble, admittedly, but one that's very engaged on these issues, lots of these things, geoengineering, carbon capture, would be seen as almost, a failure or a defeat in some way, and a way to keep, business as usual alive. And technology more broadly can often be viewed as, a tool of capital because, frankly, that's who owns it. So, I wonder what you make of that, and do you see that perspective as a problem?
Yeah. To the extent that there still is a left environmentalist position that is like anti-technology, I just want to speak for a left that acknowledges that the technology is under human control and that humans have been technological since before they were humans, that fire and use of stones was pre-human and made us into human beings. So we co-evolved with technologies. Question is, how are they used, but also who owns them? So each one of these is different in its implications. Geoengineering is like an emergency operation that has been offered by scientists to reduce the Earth's fever while we get to the underlying causes. Nobody is offering geoengineering as a thing to do while we continue to burn fossil fuels. Step one is to stop emitting fossil fuels, burning them into the atmosphere. During that time, which will take a couple more decades, the Earth is already too hot. You cool it down so that you don't accidentally run through some planetary boundaries and create a hothouse Earth, which wrecks everything. It's a greenhouse effect that runs out of control. There's no ice on the planet. Sea level is 270 feet higher, etc. That would wreck civilization. At that point, your political orientation means nothing. Your theories mean nothing because civilization is wrecked. And then you're in one of these sorry, sad-ass survivalist novels. Nobody wants that. So then what do? Well, cool the planet down for a while you solve the underlying illnesses. You decarbonize. That will take several decades, pulling that CO2 back out of the atmosphere. If you want to call that geoengineering, you can, but the word is worthless. What you really mean is the CO2 that we put up in the atmosphere, we need to pull it back down. It's going to be hard because there's billions of tons of it. And that activity needs to be valorized and paid for. You need to be able to make your living at it. So I don't want to make up straw men here. So often what you do is you make a straw man out of your nearest allies and then beat the hell out of that straw man while your actual enemies are capering about doing their evil things. So the left is a broad front. Anybody who's left of the center, even the center itself, they're allies. And then it's the right that's the enemy. It's the right that is really in a Götterdämmerung. They want to wreck the earth. It validates their anthropocentric, narcissistic point of view. So everybody else who's trying to work to save the earth, okay, they've got a different angle on it. They've got a different opinion, a different emphasis. Big deal. The front is broad. They have to do their work. You have to do your work. So I try not to get too irritated, but I want to speak for science. Science is a leftism. Science is utopian. Science is a under-theorized politics in action, in that every scientific endeavor is trying to figure out how the world works and trying to make it better. What is that but a leftism? So it can be bought. Capital can buy science, put a gun to its head and say, look, make the drugs I want, make the bombs I want, make the profit that I want. And science says, well, I want to find out how ancient turtles are. Are they 50 million years old? Are they 200 million years old? Science says, all right, I'll do what you want. Just give me my salary and I'll do my science. And then capital prances off with all of the good that has been created by science. That's one description of our world right now. So a lot of judo is involved in trying to turn the tables on capital's rule of our society and turn it over to science. And this is sort of why I like government and the bureaucracies. Those are all now scientifically run institutions, in that sociology and statistics runs these places. It's not nepotism. It's not inherited wealth. It's simply rule of law and the statistics of what people want. So that in itself makes it a kind of leftism.
It's really interesting. And I guess you kind of hit on a point there that I think maybe speaks to concerns that I have, I suppose, which is that feels so insurmountable at the moment, the degree to which, technologies and ownership of them have been sort of monopolized by capital. And, I'm thinking, no one's pushing carbon capture and storage more than your Exxon Mobils, who see it, I do think, as a way to continue, exploiting their oil reserves to the greatest extent possible. It doesn't have to be that way,
yes.
But it feels, I think, quite insurmountable, their monopolization of that space. So I guess the question that I have is, how, if we sort of want to reclaim science as the kind of utopian and leftist project that you describe, and which intuitively, I think I feel quite strongly aligned with, then what is, I guess, sorry, this is an impossible question, but what is, the sequencing? How do we get to that when it's sort of so captured at this moment? And, that's explored a lot, I guess, in your novels, both through revolutions, both successful and unsuccessful, but also in Ministry, which we've talked about, sabotage and destruction of property. So do you see these kinds of avenues, I guess, as the necessary kind of step to achieve these longer ends and to, I guess, liberate science and reclaim it as a leftist project? Or how do you think about how we overcome the enormous scale of capital's power and ownership of science as it stands right now and kind of that space? Sorry, I'm asking you to solve all of our problems. This is kind of an impossible question, but, I'd love to know how you see it and whether your novels reflect what you see as, a practical approach.
Well, the thing is, it's the basic question, because it's the strategy, and then you figure out the tactics. And it is maybe the question of history itself. How do you get out of feudalism? Think of capitalism as late feudalism, the same power dynamics, the same hierarchy, the same inequality. In fact, the inequality between human beings in our moment is worse than it was in the feudal period, worse than in any moment in human history right now. So how do we fight that fight? Well, all across the board. And to pick one particular that you did bring up, carbon capture, ExxonMobil is a criminal organization, and all private capitalist fossil fuel that have been lying since the 1960s in order to continue to sell their product, they're criminals and ought to be treated as such, like thrown in jail. But, however, 75% of the fossil fuels on this planet are owned by national governments. And most of those national governments have been corrupted by the money of fossil fuels itself pouring into their coffers and being kept by the people running the government. Kleptoparasitism, the petrostates. But I've been exploring this notion of the virtuous petrostate, which one of my good friends says is simply an oxymoron, that there is no such thing as a virtuous petrostate. But let's take one specific example. A leftist government was elected in Colombia. Petro and Marquez says to the world, we want to stop burning our coal. They're the fifth biggest coal producer on earth, that country, and they own it. And they say, we want to stop burning it. We need financial help in order to make that transition and keep that stuff in the ground. No help from the world. So this is my point. The international financial community, the developed nations of the world, the G7, the UN, all of the ways in which we organize the nation state system ought to be looking at ways of helping the petrostates to wean themselves from oil. And then 75% of the fossil fuels on this planet that have been identified would be kept in the ground because the nation states involved would realize that they're burning their own feet off when they sell that stuff. They're killing their own children when they sell that stuff. But they need financial help. They need to run their teachers, their police, their armies, their airports. And nation states are huge in the world economy. And maybe that is to say that private capital is important, but it's not all important. And the nation states make the laws. So when you want to defeat private capital, you look to change the laws. And you look to send the money elsewhere because it's the governments that are backing money itself, fiat money. In fact, the biggest mistake I made in my book was to mention the word blockchain. I would take it out if I could. That's a dismal form of cryptography. There are easier ways to make private codes that are unbreakable that could digitalize money, because money is digitalized anyway. So I think blockchain is way too energy inefficient and way too energy expensive, and it's always been captured by the notion of Bitcoin. So forget about blockchain. And I'm not. There aren't really new technologies that I present in my novel. They're all old. Wind power, solar power, but also justice and law. These are technologies. They're software for the hardware that is civilization, and software matters hugely. But to the heart of your question, unfortunately, pulls us right back to politics. It will be a wicked political battle to win enough people's support to elect leaders that will actually do the healthy leftist program, as opposed to working for the oligarchs that have supported their campaigns. So then you need campaign reform. You need to convince the people to vote for the right causes, for their own self-interest. And so politics comes back again, and technology will never be magic enough to solve that one. We decide what humanity wants to do together collectively. That's another left position. There's no leaders that are smart enough or selfless enough to make good decisions for us. It needs to be mass action and push from below to make the political leadership do what people have decided they want to do. How do they decide? Well, by discourse, by the discussion that's happening amongst us all. So then a burden falls on the left, and that's okay. That's one definition of what the project is. You've got to persuade everybody who isn't a leftist that this is the most healthy and just way to go forward.
Yeah, I think that last point speaks so powerfully to me, which is that connection that you sort of refer to there indirectly of, this sense of political alienation that has been driving so much of our politics, for the past several years now. I mean, without oversimplifying it too much, as you and I record this morning, this will be a few weeks later for those listening, but, we've just seen the election results out of East Germany and the successful election of the AfD. We're seeing this, I guess, kind of all over the place, this sort of total rejection of traditional centrist liberal politics and the rise of an increasingly far-right all over the world that's often hostile to action on the climate. And I think the massive kind of inequality and disenfranchisement that liberal capitalism has generated comes through quite powerfully in ministry. You've got this gorgeous line about enough being as much as a feast or better or something like that. And I'm paraphrasing poorly, but I think it's so often missing from how climate is engaged with in the media and in politics as this kind of purely technocratic problem, as opposed to, completely enmeshed in these really integral questions about inequality.
Yeah.
So did you just want to just speak to that a little bit?
I do, because I think you put your finger on it. When people feel they're in an unequal system and that it isn't fair, and that their prospects for them and their family and their town are screwed by a global system that doesn't care about them and that makes, in the case of executives versus workers 1,000 times more money for doing less work. The anger is such that the voters can say, let's break this system. It's not for me. And then you get the nativist, populist, right-wing, racist, and fearful response. Can't trust other people. In fact, I just read a detailed description of the German voters, and it's remarkable how the people voting for the far right in East Germany, which is emptying out, people are moving from East Germany to West Germany. So people are seeing their lives and their towns disappear on them because of the political system. So they want to break it. But they don't even trust any other human beings. The distrust has grown. And so the Greens take an enormous slam, because why should you care about the rest of the planet when your own town is dying from people leaving town? This is a worldwide question. And so you have to be able to try to reestablish trust and fairness and a sense of justice in the world for people to trust the idea that all the other people in the world are trying just as hard as you are to make the system go. And that can't happen where executives make 1,000 times more than workers, and where 1% of the population owns more wealth than the poorest 60% of the world's population. 1% we are in an absurd situation. It's ridiculous and indefensible. So nobody even tries to defend it. They just try to sequester their money and escape into a private island. So the political battle is indeed intense, because when you have hope versus fear, fear is very immediate and intense. Hope is very permanent and I would say biological in nature. And hope is persistent as hell, but it's also hard to muster it when you're in such incredible inequality. So we're in a very bad state, not even speaking environmentally, but speaking socially.
We're very positive today. But I just want to come to a final kind of fundamental tension when it comes to the climate and ecological crises that I think is really foregrounded in your work. It's there in Ministry, but it kind of constitutes the whole story of the Mars trilogy, which is this kind of debate between, should we terraform this planet? Is it within our rights to do so? Or is it more, our duty to leave this environment kind of intact and as it is? And that conflict sort of personified by key characters in that series. But it also comes through, I think, in this more meta way in your work, which is that, we've spoken about how inherent to science fiction is this engagement with technology and progress and this kind of Promethean power. But in your most recent book, which is not fiction, but actually a memoir of your time spent kind of hiking in the high Sierras of California, and how being embedded in wilderness and this vast nature has shaped your life and thinking. And to me, this feels like this kind of tension inherent to the scramble we're all in when it comes to fighting the climate crisis, because the other side of that coin is an ecological crisis that, while it's wrapped up with climate, often I think stands in tension with it. Because on the one hand, we need this immense build out of kind of new infrastructure and technology and clean energy and all the kind of demands on the planet and on natural systems that implies, versus this sort of kind of classic environmentalist tradition whose message is, how can we tread as lightly on this earth as possible and preserve as much of it as we can as wilderness and, all these kinds of traditions. So I'd just be really interested to know, both in your work, but also in your personal politics, how you think about these two priorities and the tensions between them, or indeed whether you see them as standing in tension at all.
Well, I recognize that very often it is regarded as a tension, but I think this is a way to split the left. It's a creating straw men out of your allies and not understanding that in the larger picture you are allies. I would say the environmentalist view. I'm an environmentalist, whatever that means now, an eco-socialist, let's put it that way. And so why the adjective eco, the prefix on socialist? Because we're on a planetary system, and amongst our fellow citizens are trees and bacteria, fish, and every living thing is part of our body, literally so in the case of our gut microbiome. So you have to put eco onto your socialism, which in its historical manifestation did not give a damn about nature, which was simply the raw material to make a world order that was for people. And people were regarded as monads, singular or collective, but in any case, nature was just the raw material to keep us happy. Well, it's actually part of our body, so you can't regard like your left leg as something that could be cut off and then you're going to be fine. That's just not true. So the eco has to be included. And the planet is robust. Life on the planet is robust. Life on this planet will be fine no matter what we do to it. If we create hothouse Earth and wreck civilization, life will proliferate. If we create a mass extinction event and kill off many thousands of species, which is quite possible, we've already started that, the planet will be fine. The biospheres will change, new creatures will evolve, and if humanity goes extinct, it will be like sharks. Well, sharks haven't gone extinct. It'll be like the dinosaurs. A big deal as far as the Earth's ecology is concerned. But for us personally, once you recognize you're part of a biosphere that is completely integral with each other, that we're imbricated and involved, that we're coexistent with every breath, with every drink, we are expressions of this planet's ecology. We're part of its living texture, part of a web. Then you do what's right for the planet. That happens to be precisely coterminous and equivalent to doing right for other human beings. It's justice for the other living beings that aren't human. They get representation and they become citizens. But also for us, we need equality amongst us. And so, again, political choices that are power related, oh, well, let's burn fossil fuels rather than solar power, are being made without regard for the ultimate health of all of us. And then more detailed questions. Solar power covers an immense amount of the deserts of the world. Well, big deal. I mean, I say this, big deal. The world is way bigger than that. You can power the entire world by covering a patch of the earth that is minute in the larger scale of things. And it's way better for the earth than burning fossil fuels into the atmosphere. There might someday be a better technology than solar power. Who knows? Although there's an awful lot of sunlight pouring onto this planet. And if we can turn that to human use, that seems the best way. And it's already proving to be cheaper than burning new oil. So the technology questions, here's how I want to sum it up. Many people, including leftists, confuse science and capitalism. And we need to de-strand those two and declare science to be good, a leftist political praxis, and declare capitalism to be bad, wealth privatized and concentrated to a tiny feudal aristocracy that rules the rest of us, an oligarchy system. Now, this is Manichaean and simplistic. It's like I'm using sock puppets on, Mr. Rogers or the Muppets. A couple sock puppets, science versus capitalism, beating on each other like Miss Piggy and Kermit the Frog. So what? You need orientation in a world this complex. And big ideas are really what philosophy and politics is all about. And so I feel like my description of the situation is accurate and needs to be shared. It's why I write my novels. I would like more people to see the situation like that, because then it informs their daily praxis in their own individual lives. That's why I call that my novels are my political action, because I want to spread this view that science good, capitalism bad. Let's act on that.
Well, I think that actually brings me to my last question. And again, I'm going to sort of ask you to oversimplify here, so apologies, but theme of the day. Sorry, yeah, we all need heuristics, I guess.
Yes.
But you mentioned
Indeed.
at the beginning this idea that you've got sort of the classic of the utopian genre, where you sort of arrive transplanted into you, or indeed dystopia. Whereas so much of what you write focuses on the very messy, fraught in between, from the now until that future in which we might find ourselves. So in this in-between, what would you say is the greatest risk or concern that you see in terms of where we stand in our fight against the climate crisis? And on a more positive note, maybe, what most recently has made you feel the most hopeful about the progress that we're making and the direction that we're taking?
Well, I think the biggest risk is that we will feel like we're doing pretty good and we're moving pretty fast compared to before on dealing with climate change and reducing emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And we will be a little complacent and accidentally cross some planetary boundaries and begin to release the methane and carbon that is in the permafrost and sequestered elsewhere on Earth up into the atmosphere to where we get a runaway greenhouse effect that at that point, even if all humanity said, oops, we should have paid attention, we didn't, now let's solve it. At that point, it would be outside of our powers to solve it. No human power enough to solve a runaway greenhouse effect. We're not that close to that particular slippery slope cliff, but we don't know how far away we are. Johann Rockstrom and the Potsdam Institute with his papers on planetary boundaries in nature, that's a crucial heuristic. Let's not accidentally cross any planetary boundaries from a sense that, oh, we're doing pretty good. So, and that would lead to human suffering. I mean, the first chapter of Ministry for the Future describes a heat wave and an energy crash at the same time. That could so easily happen even right now. That we're all too close to that, and we ought to be taking it even more seriously than we are. And then, I don't know, in terms of my hopes, the planet's biosphere is robust. If we get through the narrow gate of the next decade or two in style, in a good way, and get more equality and more ecological balance into the political system, the population will begin to drop because of women's rights. As soon as society has full set of human rights for everybody, population begins to slide down just from the nature of parenting and of human life. And then that won't be a catastrophe. That will be full employment. And full employment is a goal of the left. So nobody should worry about human population going down. In fact, there are some people who say the human population that would be best for this biosphere is about 3 billion people, which it was in my lifetime. So it's not that radical of a claim. Things were not terrible in terms of humanity in the year 1960. But the way people moan and groan about, oh my God, the population is going down, this is completely false economics that is being expressed. You can't have capitalist growth when the population is going down, but who gives a damn about capitalist growth? So what I see as the possibility is we get through this narrow gate of the next few decades without catastrophe, and it'll be a scramble. It will be painful. There will be reversals. It will be a close run thing. But if we get there, the possibilities from there on for justice and for enough for all, adequacy, and a non-mass extinction event, a flourishing biosphere, that all exists as a human achievement that we can get along with everything else alive on this planet in a way that means that everybody's doing well and gets to live their fullest version of themselves, whatever that might be. So, utopia, dystopia, we sit here at some kind of bizarre crux point. And I want to point out that at every moment of human history, people have probably felt exactly the same. But at this moment, the stakes are planetary and biospheric in ways that it's never been true before. So, this is especially for young people like yourself, the whole rest of your life, you're going to be seeing this violent soap opera as to can humanity actually get a grip over its relationship to the biosphere and to each other. It'll never come to an end.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that's a pretty good middlingly optimistic place to
We don't deserve more. We don't deserve more optimism than that.
Still a long way to go. But Kim Stanley Robinson, just want to say thank you so much for joining us on The Breakdown today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to The Breakdown. Our sound and videography are by Ralph Pritchard, and our music is by Thomas Halstead.
If visuals are your thing, you can find every episode with video on YouTube or on our website at www.break-down.org, where you can also find essays and other resources from brilliant contributors. Follow us on social media at break_down radio. I'm Adrienne Bowler, thanks for listening, and see you on the next episode.